Hello, Turkey's president has vowed to keep fighting in Syria until all his country's goals have been met. Recep Tayyip Erdogan is shrugging off international pressure for an immediate ceasefire, and the battle on the ground goes on. The town of Ras Al Ain is on the front line. Gunfire and heavy artillery have been heard right across the city as Turkish and Kurdish forces fight for control. Now, diplomatic efforts are also intensifying. The U.S. Vice President Mike Pence and the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will travel to Turkey to push for a ceasefire. They come armed with President Trump's threat of more sanctions if they're ignored. But that's unlikely to sway President Erdogan. In an address to his AK party, he said he won't be influenced by foreign intimidation.
Bu yöndeki tekliflere de üstü örtülü veya açık tehditlere de
All the suggestions and threats we're not going to accept. I think that has been clear from the start by our attitude. We want this terror organization removed from our borders. When the zone from Manbij to the Iraqi border, when we establish this 35-kilometer deep safe zone, this operation will end. But up until reaching this point, no power can stop us.
Well, Erdogan's also defended the operation against critics who say civilians are in the line of fire. He says Turkey has never and will never commit a civilian massacre.
sivil katliamı görmek istiyorsanız hemen burnunuzun dibinde.
If you want to see civilian casualties, look at the streets of Palestine, where Muslims are killed in the streets. If you want to see civilian massacres, look at the terror organization who killed our women, our elderly, our children. They were killed by them in the last 40 years. If you want to see civilian massacres, look in the mirror and look at history and look at all the blood of the innocents in your own hands. Turkey can never be accused.
Meanwhile, the UN Special Envoy for Syria is in Damascus, and he's calling for an immediate end to the Turkish operation. And a meeting's been called at the UN to discuss Syria. Our diplomatic editor, James Bass, will tell us more about that shortly, while our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, is standing by in Washington. First, we bring in Zena Khudr, who's in Akçakale, that's on the Turkish-Syria border, with a defiant message, Zena, from Erdogan. How's the Turkish military operation playing out on the ground right now?
Well, it hasn't been easy. It's now entering its second week. Fierce combat in Ras Al Ain. That is a border town. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces mounting a fierce defense, using tunnels, using trenches. So it's not an easy fight. And Ras Al Ain may be a small border town, but it is key in Turkey's plans to create a safe zone along the border east of the Euphrates, because Ras Al Ain should be part of this safe zone. So fierce combat on the ground, and Russia stepping in. The United States has left the area, but Russia making clear who is calling the shots. They have deployed their military police on front lines, laying claim to a number of areas. Manbij, for example, a key town in the northern countryside of Aleppo, which Turkey also wanted to capture. It wanted its local Syrian allies to take control of Manbij from the Syrian Kurdish armed group, the YPG, which makes up the backbone of the SDF. And now it's no longer able to advance towards the city because of the deployment of Russian troops. So on the ground, it is facing resistance and, like you mentioned, diplomatic pressure, the greatest crisis in decades with its NATO ally, the United States. Erdogan telling the U.S., no, I'm not interested in a ceasefire, I'm not interested in negotiations. But most importantly, serious differences with Russia, a country that it is a partner with in Syria. It should be working together with Syria. Russia making it clear it's not happy with the Turkish intervention in Syria. It is not happy with Turkey's military presence in Syria altogether. So Russia really putting a lot of pressure on Turkey. And Erdogan yesterday calling the Russian President Putin inviting Erdogan, but we still don't know the date of that meeting.
Okay, Zena Khudr with an update from Akçakale. Thank you. Well, speaking before he heads to Turkey, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has made it clear that he'll be pushing for an end to the offensive.
And we have every expectation that we will meet with President Erdogan.
You know,
and it's important, Maria. We need to have this conversation with him directly. President felt it was important that we do this at the most senior levels of the United States government, to speak to him face to face. He needs to stop. He needs to stop the incursion into Syria. This is a complicated matter with lots of states at play.
Let's break this down with Kimberly Halkett. She's joining us from Washington. So what are we to make of the president sending such a high-level delegation to Turkey, Kimberly?
Well, the U.S. president is very clear that he wants to send a message, and essentially that message is that the United States is looking for an immediate ceasefire and negotiated settlement. So this is what the hope is, that this delegation expected to leave Washington about 22 GMT, head over to meet for the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, saying there what they expect to be a face-to-face meeting with the Turkish leader is to try and achieve these goals. Now, we should point out in just the last hour or so, the U.S. president has been speaking about the situation from the Oval Office. We expect that this tape playback will be coming in soon, but we are starting to get some early notes from it. And the U.S. president is once again defending his decision to move aside troops in order for Turkey to make its way in terms of this military operation. He's defending this decision, saying if Turkey goes into Syria, it is between Turkey and Syria. It's not our problem, meaning the United States. But clearly, there is a feeling that it is the United States problem, or this high-level delegation would not be being sent. The other thing coming out of this meeting with the Italian president at the Oval Office is this statement from U.S. President Donald Trump, essentially saying the Kurds are no angels. And this is getting a lot of traction, given there is a real feeling in the United States that this decision by the United States to pull back troops has betrayed the Kurds. The fact that the Kurds, who lost 11,000 people fighting alongside U.S. troops in the effort to defeat ISIL, that the United States has just turned its back on these fighters, and the U.S. president sort of doubling down on that insult by saying the Kurds are no angels. So these are the latest statements coming out of the White House. As I said, we expect that not only will we see that tape playback soon, we also expect the U.S. president to have more to say on this when he has a joint presser with the Italian president in the coming hours. And then later, about 19 GMT at the White House, the U.S. president will be meeting with congressional leaders also not happy with his Syria-Turkey strategy, that are putting together their own legislation right now to essentially try and undo the president's moves.
All right, a lot going on over there. Kimberly Halkett, for the time being, thank you for that update. Let's bring in our diplomatic editor, James Bays, joining us from the United Nations. And not the first time, James, that European members of the Security Council have requested a meeting on what's taking place in northeast Syria. What do we expect to happen?
Yes, well, we believe that meeting is about to get underway in the next few minutes. In fact, let's just show you the picture over here. That is actually the doorway into the Security Council, where the closed meeting will be taking place. What they've been doing is having a meeting about Western Sahara. That meeting, we understand, has just come to an end, or is about to come to an end, and then they're moving on to the agenda item about Syria and what's going on in northeast Syria. And we've just seen the two UN briefers come in who will be briefing the Security Council in that closed meeting. The head of humanitarian affairs, Mark Lowcock, and Khalid Kiani, who's the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. They will be briefing the Security Council on the current situation. We've seen a few ambassadors around here outside the meeting while they were discussing Western Sahara. Interesting sighting a short time ago. I saw the Turkish ambassador here, although he's now left the area ahead of this closed meeting, which was called by European members of the Security Council.
Since we last spoke, the situation has not improved, quite the contrary. The number of IDPs, the number of people needing humanitarian aid, the number of people who are fleeing this area reaches 200,000, and the humanitarian situation just is very, very worrying.
We are still very concerned about all the implications of this offensive, humanitarian, obviously. A lot of people on the run. And another concern is also about Daesh, the possible resurgence, the fact that apparently some prisoners have been able to escape. So all this is absolutely very concerning. And so that's why the EU members of the Council have called for this meeting because things are really evolving very rapidly on the ground, as you know.
Some interesting developments just as this meeting moves behind closed doors from Western Sahara to Syria, and that's the US Ambassador Kelly Craft has actually left the area and headed away, whether that's for some discussions quietly with some of her colleagues and she'll be returning, or whether she's not staying for the Syria agenda item isn't clear. Certainly when they discussed this last week, she came out and made a statement at the end to reporters taking no questions. What the Europeans are hoping is that they can get a unified statement from the Security Council, even if it's a pretty brief one, expressing concern. I'm told that that is something they are hoping for, but not necessarily expecting. And if they don't get that, we believe what's most likely is that we'll see the European ambassadors come to the podium here themselves and make their own statement.
Okay, James, we'll cross to you a little later. Thank you for that update from the United Nations. Let's talk to Berin Kayoglu. He's an assistant professor of world history at the American University of Iraq. He's joining us from Ankara. Thanks very much for your time with us on the Al Jazeera NewsHour. Let's first talk about the U.S. delegation that's headed to Ankara in a couple of hours' time. They're pushing for a negotiated ceasefire. That's what we're being told. But Erdogan, according to what he's saying, is in no mood to negotiate. So to what extent do you expect to see some sort of agreement or some sort of understanding between the two sides when they meet?
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I believe from the Turkish perspective, there are two things. Either President Erdogan and President Trump agreed on what the nature of the Turkish operation into Syria would be, or both men prefer sort of off-the-cuff, rather casual conversations over more formal commitments, and agreed actually that the Turkish operation will turn out to be this way. But facing domestic backlash, President Trump decided to second-guess himself and started imposing sanctions on Turkey. And as a result of that, President Erdogan, of course, is responding to a domestic audience, a domestic expectation that he believes would respond more positively to an operation in northern Syria against YPG SDF forces, which are known to be allied with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a group that has been fighting the Turkish government since 1984. Erdogan, it's not going to be easy for President Erdogan to stop the offensive when he has committed himself so much, but I believe that there will be modalities and possibility of working something out with the Trump administration, given the very high-level nature of the delegation that is about to arrive in Ankara.
What do you make of the international pressure that seems to be piling up on President Erdogan, as well as the threat of more U.S. sanctions?
I believe at the heart of that problem lies a very serious misunderstanding on Turkey's part. On the one hand, because of Turkey's problems with the PKK, Turkey's own inability to resolve its Kurdish question, successive Turkish governments with very different ideological viewpoints and social and political bases have continued to see the PKK as an existential threat for Turkey. After the Syrian civil war, especially with the rise of the PYD and its armed groups, the YPG, which evolved into the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, Turkey has insisted on the international arena that it does not consider PKK as fundamentally different than ISIS. This argument has not hold water in the international community. Basically, everyone you talk to who follows the Syrian civil war sees the YPG forces as the anti-ISIS and a very effective force that has played a critical role in defeating ISIS. Now,
right,
it is
a
fact that
if this
YPG
international pressure continues to pile on Ankara, my question to you is it going to have any impact on President Erdogan and the trajectory of the military operation?
I would be lying to you if I said I knew the answer to that question. But I can say this much. Turkish President Erdogan is someone who has always acted in his best political interest. And currently it is not in his best political interest to risk further sanctions, destabilize his country's economy further, and then risk his own domestic political standing. So I do expect him to perhaps declare some sort of victory, because the Turkish military has made some headway in northern Syria, and then start talking with Turkey's Western partners, the United States and the European Union.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Baron Kayoglu, we thank you very much for speaking to us from Ankara.